A few weeks ago, I shared my experience of a Havdalah event that I attended and that I really enjoyed. And it was there that I met Yoshi Silverstein, who led an amazing Jewish embodiment workshop and who is my guest today. So, hi,
Oh,
Yoshi.
hi, great to be on.
Thank you. Thank you for doing this. So Yoshi is the founder and executive director of the Mitsui Collective. He will tell us more about this in just a moment, but I say we start from the very beginning. So I know this is going to sound somewhat stereotypical, but when I first saw you, Yoshi, I didn't think Jewish, right? When I saw you,
Sure.
I was like, okay, maybe he's Jewish somehow, but how? And then you introduced yourself and you told us. So can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure, yeah. I am a Chinese Ashkenazi American Jew, identify as a Jew of color. And yeah, I am Ashkenazi Eastern European Jewish on my dad's side and Chinese on my mom's side. My dad's side comes from kind of classic Ashkenazi locations, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland slash Russia, depending on where the border was, at that time.
Yeah.
And yeah, his family came to the States in the early 20th century. And then my mom's side is Chinese, and her parents actually, her grandma, or sorry, my grandma, her mom
Hmm.
was born and raised in Guyana. And then came to the States from Guyana. So we actually have a little bit of this kind of Caribbean cultural influence as well. And as I like to say, I'm a child of the diaspora in like all ways, right?
Yeah.
And so I think I grew up in Spokane, Washington, which is in eastern Washington, 20 minutes from Idaho, very small Jewish community. And I think that relationship to land and place and culture and lineage, like all of those have been really kind of active and alive for me my whole life. And I think have played out in all sorts of ways in terms of certainly personally, but also professionally in terms of um, the different learning and work and practice that I have always been most interested in. And I think what I love about Judaism is I think it gives us sort of this like framework or lens to do that exploration
Hmm.
um, in a way that can both ground and connect us to all of these different lineages that many of us hold, whether it's the sort of more, yeah, classic or stereotypical or Ashken normative, so to speak, way that a lot of folks think about, certainly American Jews, or folks like me who have, some mix of backgrounds or come from others. I think Judaism can hold all of that in some really rich ways.
Wow, that's really interesting. Yes, because typically in Judaism, you are considered a Jew if your mother is Jewish. In your case, it's your father. So I
Right.
was wondering exactly like what was it about Judaism that drew you in? And you kind of explained that. But when did you start to feel this connection to
Mhm.
Judaism? Did you
Yeah.
grow up Jewish?
Yeah. So I did grow up Jewish. Yeah, my mom actually is Jewish now. She converted.
Okay.
She converted after my sister and I were born, and we were raised at a conservative synagogue, which does follow, the matrilineal descent. So I went through my own conversion process before, right, the year before my bar mitzvah. Um, and so I sort of like to say I am both a Jew by choice and a patrilineal Jew, right? And
Okay.
so there's plenty of reform, plenty of movements that do hold by the patrilineal descent as well, and which I strongly believe in. So I sort of have multiple pathways, right,
Okay.
through which that and yeah, actually, my mom she was always fully on board with us having a Jewish family. And in the early times, before she and my dad got married, etc., she did not see at that time the need to personally become Jewish in order to have a Jewish family. And so yeah, we were raised, like many other American Jewish families, we celebrated, Hanukkah and Passover and sort of the big things, and we were
Right.
not, particularly involved in our local synagogue. And that changed as I got a little bit older. And this story it's funny, so it's worth telling.
Mhm.
I was in a Montessori school for elementary, and of course, the two other guys that were in my grade were also Jewish. I mean,
Oh.
again, Spokane, Washington just does not have a large Jewish community, but we kind of cluster. Um, so one of my friends, Isaac, he was at Hebrew school, and that was the year that we had, Hebrew school started. I think it was third grade, and I decided not to go. My older sister hadn't gone, and I just sort of didn't see the need. So this was a couple months into the year, and he came into school one day and said, "Yosh, you got to see what we learned in Hebrew school last night." And he showed me how to write doo doo in Hebrew. So third grader again.
That's
I thought
funny.
it was hilarious. And I was like, wait, that's what you're learning in Hebrew school? And I literally went home that night. I was like, Mom, you got to sign me up for Hebrew school. I had like no idea. And she was like, okay. She's like, well, this year's already started. I'm not going to like sign you up now, but you can start next year. So I had a tutor and got caught up and whatnot. Um, and here I am running, 30 whatever years later, running a Jewish nonprofit organization, right? So
Right.
you never know what those kind of seeds can be.
That's
And
right.
yeah, I think as I got older, my bar mitzvah, I mean, my Torah portion was Nitzavim Vayelech, which has one of those really, there's, I mean, obviously a lot of great lines in the Torah, but this line is when Moses is sort of giving his final, speech before the Israelites, they're about to enter the land of Israel without him. Um, and he says, I set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. Choose life that you and your descendants may live. And so I remember being on the bima for my bar mitzvah, my rabbi pulling out that verse and saying, every step along the way, you have really chosen your Jewishness, your Jewish
Right.
life, your Jewish identity, etc. And that's really powerful. And that has really stuck with me. And I think even though, right, I sort of technically or formally made the choice to become Jewish, to become a Jew by choice, I feel like that continues. And I think actually for all of us today, it's like an ongoing choice. It's very easy to
Yeah.
just kind of stop. I mean, you don't stop being Jewish in terms of your identity, but to stop being sort of like actively Jewish or
Yeah.
practicing in any way, it's really easy. Like there's a lot of other great stuff to do in the world. So I
Absolutely.
think for those of us, who that's important, it is an active choice every day sometimes. And so I think about that a lot. And yeah, and last thing I'll just say to your question is I think with that and then high school and beyond, um, I started to get more and more involved in Jewish youth group and also sort of Jewish creative pursuits. For a long time, that was music and in sort of the music and then nature connection. And so I think I found when I looked at some of these different areas that I was interested in and looked at them through a Jewish lens or with some sort of Jewish anchoring or grounding, it helped it feel that much more kind of rooted and connected to just this like deep part of who I was. I think actually like a spiritual sense of connection. And so that was music. And then the first part of my career was in Jewish nature education, sort of using sort of Jewish experiences in nature to really connect us to ourselves and our community and the world of creation.
Well,
Yeah.
that's really awesome. I mean, I honestly have never met anyone with that kind of educational background and how you put everything together. That's pretty amazing. And I was just going to say too that it's interesting. For example, let's say you're by parents half Jewish and you identified with Judaism and you went for it and you actively sought it out. And then there are Jews who are 100% Jewish and they want
Right.
nothing to do with it. And I'm very familiar with that because coming from the Soviet Union, I grew up without religion, period. And
Right.
I didn't know anything about Judaism until my family immigrated to the United States. And to this day, really, I'm the only one that is pursuing Judaism and actually becoming active with it. So it's just really interesting how some people find that connection and
Mm.
others don't. But sort of, I feel like part of what I want to do with my podcast is try to get as many Jews to become active and to
Right.
feel that spiritual connection because when you do, I mean, it's life-changing, at least for me. I know, and that's why I talk about all these experiences in my podcast because not only do you heal physically and mentally and emotionally and spiritually. It's so life-changing in a positive way. And
Right.
so, yeah, I thought you would have a lot to say about that
Right.
too
Yeah.
today. But yeah, so Like you just started mentioning a little bit about what you've studied and what you do. When I read your resume, it was very impressive. And so, could you tell us a little bit about some of your most prominent projects, accomplishments? I know you have a lot, but some
Great.
of them.
Yeah, I mean, I just yeah, I have a lot of interests and I love to learn and you know, I have ADHD, so my brain is going lots of different ways, and obviously that brings certain challenges, but I think it also helps me to sort of really see connections between things and um I like to say I have a hard time keeping hobbies hobbies because
Mm.
if I get really interested in something, I then see ways in which it is or can be connected to all these other facets of sort of my work and interests. And so then it sort of gets pulled in, to like work I'm already doing. So I have to be careful, with like trying new things out because like, oh, if I
Sure.
really like this, it's probably gonna just add on.
Uh-huh.
Uh, yeah, so I spent really the first 15 or so years of my life in Jewish outdoor nature-based education. Um, and like I said before, I think that, and that was sort of it was like an epiphany in college, or actually the real epiphany, which followed the misguided epiphany. I had just gone through a breakup and was in this, classic, very, sad, depressed place of like, oh, what's my life gonna be after, I thought it was going this way, and now it's, and all of that. And sort of in the midst of that, and I thought I went pre-med for a year halfway through college. It did not go well. It was like clearly not the right choice. I thought for a minute I wanted to be a pediatrician.
Oh, wow.
Uh, I mean, because I had worked as been a camp counselor and, been a mitzvah tutor. And like, I knew liked working with kids. And so I
Mhm.
think that was part of the kind of, um, the what compelled me towards that, and also looking back on it, like, and now I do embodiment work, which I'll talk about, but I think there was also this like, oh, like working with the body and working with wellness and healing, actually there was more of a seed there early on than I realized.
Okay.
And so, but the sort of like pre-med, sort of classic, medicine track was not the right track for me. And I went through that breakup, and then I was like, oh, what am I going to do with my life? And so in the midst of that, I sort of started to reflect, okay, what are the things that have been most compelling and really nourishing for me? And that's when I thought about, oh, these experiences that I had had in Jewish community, in nature, and sort of especially where there was some combination of those things, were these really spiritually yeah, spiritually nourishing and really compelling experiences. And so I sort of thought, oh, what would it be like? How can I facilitate those experiences for others? Oh, I think I want to be a Jewish outdoor educator. And I was like, okay, what does that look like? How do I actually do that? And there actually is that was early on, but there's now really a very robust world of Jewish nature-based education. And so I got plugged into that. And I think really as I look back on that, I think obviously, I mean, I love being in nature, but I think the part that really kind of the part that was most fascinating for me was what is our human experience
Mhm.
in nature, and what types of experiences can we have that are sort of catalysts us connect both to this larger world around us, in that sense of interconnection to the ecology and the ecosystems around us. How does it connect us to the people around us, the sort of social ecology, and then also, and how does it connect more deeply with ourselves, that sort of internal sense of connection. And so
Interesting.
nature is like just a really potent and powerful teacher in that way, that really sets the stage to have those experiences. And so
Right.
as I look back, I was like, oh, those were always the things that I loved the most and loved to bring into my teaching. And so I did that for a long time. And then I think a few different elements started to come into play. One was I was working and living in some really beautiful remote locations. I mean, I
Okay.
got to live in like the Olympic Mountains in Washington, the Central Mountains of Idaho, and up in like
Um,
rural Connecticut, and like beautiful places, but that were kind of literally peripheral to where kind of like the heart of most communities are, which is, you know, sometimes urban or semi-urban, but like, where folks really live. And to me, it was like, okay, if we're really going to deepen our impact, whether it's for nature preservation or healing or spirituality, whatever it is, those experiences of sort of leaving where your home is and going out somewhere else are really important and powerful. and they're limited because it's by nature it's like a leaving and coming home experience. So
Mm.
those are important. That's sort of like going on retreat or going on that journey. But to me, the deeper question to me is like, what happens when we come back home, and how do we actually integrate this into our day-to-day life, right?
Right.
Because if we want actual ongoing long-term change and transformation, we have to develop and be supported in a practice. And so I was seeing that in my nature education world and different things. And so I think part of that, plus just my own interest in movement and embodiment work and somatics and wellness, kind of led me to like, oh, well, turns out my body goes with me everywhere I go. Right? And so, how can we actually like work with our own bodies and also work in chavruta and partnership with others in ways that like actually we can do almost everywhere? And it's not that the space doesn't matter. I mean,
Mhm.
so I also along the way got my master's degree in landscape architecture. So
Oh,
I
wow.
clearly like I appreciate good design and I really think about that a lot. So the space does matter. And I think there's sort of like, okay, and then what do we do in the space when we're there? And so I think that led me into this world of embodiment, of really thinking about what are the practices that can connect us more deeply to ourselves, to our people, our lineages, culture, to each other, and as well as the natural
Wow.
world around us. Yeah.
That's really cool. That's really neat. So I've
Sorry
only
for the rant. I don't give short answers. I
no, that's
should have warned you at the
fine.
top.
All good. So obviously, well, not obviously, but I have only really been in one of your sort of workshops, right? At the Havdalah event. And so there I experienced some exercises that I think, correct me if I'm wrong, were designed for like cultivating awareness,
Mhm.
creativity, things like that. So I'll just give some examples to the listeners. So we had one exercise where we would drop a ball, a tennis ball, and then like our partner would have to catch it, and we would have to get creative and make it a little bit more playful and fun and see if they can catch the ball. And so we had that, and then we had the movement with music, which I found to be super liberating
Yeah.
for me. I really enjoyed that one. So yeah, is this the kind of movement that you are referring to that you can do with your body wherever you go?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think there's a whole world of movement, obviously,
Hmm.
that we can do. So yeah, from a sort of functional, practical standpoint, there's just a whole range of,
Hmm.
okay, here's movement that I need zero equipment for nothing. I just need my body and a little space to, all sorts of things that do require, whether it's a barbell or machines or I forget what the name of the Pilates machine is, whatever, but like,
Oh
where
yeah.
you need some sort of like special equipment or whatever. So that there's just a whole range,
Hmm.
of that. We do sort of trend towards the simpler in terms
Hmm.
of the need for different or the use of different tools and implements. And I think part of that is also, the accessibility, sort of having things that people can kind of jump into immediately. When I'm again traveling around, it's like,
Yeah.
what can I easily kind of carry with me? So there is just a practical element to that. And I think there's certainly good value and use to having equipment depending on just what you're trying to do with your
Hmm.
movement. So yeah, I think the different things that we were doing, this was yeah a sort of intro level,
Hmm.
workshop of bringing folks in that with any range of background. I mean, you've got a lot of dance background, right? And others have different sports, etc., and others have very little. So I'm always thinking about, okay, I don't know who's going to be in the room. So how
Hmm.
can I sort of hit a relatively wide and more accessible range in terms of how we're jumping into things, giving some sort of, and some simple prompts that most people can jump into pretty easily. They don't need a lot of background
Right.
knowledge or skill to sort of get into it, right? Um, so that was definitely part of why I chose some of those prompts. I think some of the other pieces that are particularly important is thinking about what we call embodied chavruta learning. So chavruta, it's a Hebrew word, of course. It comes from the word chaver, which is friend, or
Okay.
chaber, which is connection. That root shows up in different ways. You've also got like chevre, which is sort of
Hmm.
is like a group, not just a group of friends. It's like almost like a, I don't know,
Hmm.
it's like a tight-knit sort of like society is like chevre, it's like your
Oh,
people. And you got like havurah, which is also sort of like a DIY kind of community. So anyway, that root
okay.
shows up all over the place. Chavruta is a form of Jewish partnership learning, and that traditionally shows up in studying Jewish text. And so, just yeah, one of the most classic ways to study text is with a chavruta, with this learning partner, and it's a really special
Oh,
relationship where so like there are folks like who are deep in the study of Torah who don't just have like any chavruta. I mean, you can just sort of like partner up with who's in the room, but like there are people who have like their chavruta where this is their learning partner who in some cases this is a relationship that can go on for decades. Like it's a
wow.
really special relationship. And so the idea of this one is just anytime you're studying with another person, it's sort of this like triangulation.
Hmm.
So you have the text, and then when you add another person, you have that third point of the triangle. And so it means that I relate to the text differently because I have my Shavruta partner who is bringing their interpretation, skills, life experience, all like they're just bringing themselves into it, right? And so that creates different sort of perspectives on the text. And then also like between me and my partner, right? So it's this sort of triangulation where it really shapes the learning in a different way and it pulls things out. There's also this idea, I don't remember the exact source, but that that your Havruta partner, it's like this idea of like sharpening each other's blades or like sharpening
Oh,
your swords, which is kind of an interesting thing because it's like for studying text,
hmm.
right? But it's sort of like, yeah, like if that is your tool, right? That like there's a sharpening, a honing. So like a good Havruta partner actually like shouldn't just agree with you all the time. That's actually like that's actually maybe a sign. Well, it could be a sign of a lot of things, but in the ways that that's like not a positive thing, it's like, oh, if there, it's just like it's like when you have a yes, like your yes man, yes, but
Yes,
like leaders know, right? That like if you have people who are only saying yes to you, they're not helping shaping you, they're not keeping you accountable, all of those
makes
things.
sense.
So good chavruta will disagree with you, but in this like productive, generative way, right? That's the sort of like the sharpening. And it's like, wait, you're giving this interpretation, why? Or like tell me where that comes from. Sometimes, yeah, so whatever. So anyway, so we take that into the embodied learning where we say, yeah, it is there's a deep relationality to our embodied learning. And often as much as possible, that partner is another human, right? We can also be always, even if we don't have other people, we can always be in relationship to ourselves and in relationship to
Mm-hmm.
the environment around us. So that sort of idea of chavruta can still be there even if we're sort of doing a solo practice, but it really comes alive with other people. And so again, that sort of really shapes the learning in different ways. So with the tennis ball dropping, it's sort of like, A, it's really like I can drop the tennis ball for myself, but it's hard to really give the proper stimulus and like it's hard to surprise yourself, right? So
Mm-hmm.
your partner just functionally can do things where you're like, I'm not sure where the ball's going to go next, and so that just helps to kind of push my learning edge in that way. But also, if they're being a good partner, they're really watching and sort of seeing like, oh, where is that edge? What are you doing well? What's sort of interesting? What's hard? What's challenging? And they're constantly sort of taking that feedback and adjusting how they're giving that prompt of, in this case, dropping the ball. And then the last thing is like, and then it's different with different people because everyone's
Yeah.
different, right? So that shapes, it's like if you and I were to be partners, that would be one experience. And if it was me and somebody else, like those are different experiences. So the more that I bring that in, and I think that's part of what really shapes the practice from being purely or exclusively like a physical practice, which it is, and it's really helping with coordination and timing and like all of those sort of physical
Hmm.
qualities, but that it bring that intentionality, or in Hebrew, our kavanah, right? Like that's
Okay.
sort of what then elevates it to embodiment work, where I'm thinking about not just what am I physically doing, but some of those other qualities of am I being a good partner? And what does that look like in this case? And how can I
Hmm.
take that and practice partnership in ways that when I sort of leave the studio space, so to speak, like we've finished our practice for the day and I go back into just my regular day-to-day life, I'm actually taking those learnings and still kind of putting them into practice when I'm not dropping a tennis ball for somebody, but we're doing other partnership
Hmm.
activities,
Hmm.
just in life.
Wow. That's really neat. as you're mentioning all these Hebrew terms, I'm jotting them down in Hebrew, which I'm really proud of myself because
Yeah.
I picked up studying Hebrew again after, I don't know, like 20 years of not studying it.
Yeah.
So it's just neat. But yeah, these are really interesting and important terms that, yeah, I'll have to do some more digging on.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I should say
then,
one thing just real quick is just
mhm,
to give proper credit for the practices that we did. So those practices themselves are not like those are I've adapted those from other sort of lineages of movement work.
okay.
And so the tennis ball dropping comes kind of most directly from the work of Ido Portal, who's is originally Israeli movement researcher practitioner and has done really a lot of tremendous work in the movement sort of pedagogy world. And so I've learned a little bit with Ido, but spent a lot of time working with a lot of his students who have different schools when I was in Brooklyn, and really good friends who were involved in their school in Boulder and Denver.
Hmm.
So a lot of that work sort of is adapted from from that work. And then the you mentioned this sort of dance practice that
Yeah.
we did. They sort of involved sort of like kind of segmenting and sort of creating separating parts of the body in order to sort of reconnect and sort of really feel that reintegration in different ways and
Hmm.
get into different shapes of the body and all of that. And that comes from learning I did with a woman named Shai Faran, who, as it turns out, is also Israeli. I do I source from other folks too.
Sure.
And she lives in Berlin, but she's got an incredible choreographer and like modern dancer and dance teacher.
Oh,
And so I was at at a retreat where she was bringing some of that work in. So,
that's really cool.
just to make sure
And
I'm
also,
giving credit to like the original source and then taking and sort of weaving in some of these Jewish ideas or concepts into, like none of them would talk about embodied Shabruta, right?
mm,
They do talk about partnership in different ways. And so that's sort of our layer is saying, oh, how do we, you know, work with some of these different practices, adapt them, change them, et cetera, but then also give them, see where there's this parallel or mirroring in Jewish wisdom, Jewish cultural expression, ideas, whatever it
mhm.
is, to allow us to sort of both deepen our exploration of those things and also shape the practice, by kind of holding that additional framing.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. But you also have some connection to your Chinese roots, right?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that with the
Yeah,
movement and everything.
for sure. Yeah, so I've been a martial artist my whole life. I started when I was 5. Um, and actually grew up doing a it's this is I think just like the beauty and whatever the world of martial arts. I mean, so it's a Thai style, which it is. It's called Lotus. But it's actually an offshoot of a style called Kajukenbo, which is a hybridized style that came up in the 50s in Hawaii.
Mm.
And it's actually a hybrid. Kajukenbo is actually an acronym for Karate, Judo, Kempo, and then both Chinese American boxing. So it was like sometimes they're like, this was the first, mixed martial art. It just, cut true. Um, and of course, I mean, all of the different styles, of course, have always been influenced by other styles. Someone
Mhm.
brought this from China to Japan and to Korea, and like, like that is just the world of which culture travels, right? And
Right.
influences others. Sometimes we're more straightforward about admitting that, and sometimes we're less so, right? Um, so anyway, Lotus is this offshoot that was then sort of developed by Preeta Mahashnavang, who is a Muay Thai fighter and learned from one of the senior grandmasters of Kaju Kembo, and then wove in some of these different Thai elements, some of the Muay Thai or Thai kickboxing, and some different Thai cultural elements, and sort of like created this, new slash offshoot that he called Lotus. So that's the style that I grew up doing, but then, again, sort of I mean, karate is a Japanese style, as is Kempo, Judo. You got your Chinese boxing, but like karate and Kempo are also deeply influenced by Chinese martial arts. So there's just this whole web, right,
Right.
of how these different lineages have mixed and matched. So I studied that my whole life. Was a competitive kickboxer in high school as well. Got my black belt in Lotus senior year. got to actually travel to Thailand a couple years
Mm,
later with my family. My mom and my sister are also black belts, and
wow.
so our instructor, our head of school in Spokane, where I grew up, spent the whole summer in Thailand studying with the founder and sort of invited his like black belts and senior students. Like he's like, if you can come to Thailand, for however long, come train. And so we were there for a week, which was a really cool experience. Um, and so and then I was away from martial arts for a long time. I was trying some different things here and there in college, and then Lotus is a very small style. There's not a lot of schools, so it's not the kind of school. It's not the kind of style where you can kind of find a school almost anywhere. Like Taekwondo, for example, very, very popular.
Oh,
You can find probably multiple Taekwondo schools
oh,
almost
yeah.
almost
My
anywhere you
son
go,
does it. Yeah.
right? Exactly. So Lotus is not like that in terms of the
Hmm.
distribution. So I tried out some different things and nothing quite set. And then I was living in the mountains and different places. So I was away for a long time. Um, and then was got into actually CrossFit was one of the things that really brought me back into like the world of movement and fitness and whatnot. And then ultimately into some of the studies that I mentioned with movement in general. And so really over the last several years back in Cleveland, we've been back in Cleveland, my wife and I, and our daughter for a little over 5 years. She grew up
Oh,
here.
okay.
And we moved actually in summer of 2019. And I started at
Oh,
Mitsui Collective in February of 2020, just in time for the
just in
pandemic.
time. Yep.
Yeah. So, lots of things there. But yeah, once sort of when we got to this, post-pandemic, I was recognizing, oh, I really, really miss martial arts and I want to get back into it. There's no Lotus school here, so all right, what is available? And if I'm gonna start, learning a new style, what would that be? And I said, well, I, really like this to be a way to sort of connect more deeply into my Chinese heritage. And it's just like growing up, food was one of the most significant elements in terms of how we really stayed connected to our Chinese roots. And my mom makes amazing Chinese food that she learned from her grandpa, etc. And I do some of them decently well, right? Some of those dishes. But anyway, so I said, okay, let me learn some. I'd love to learn some Chinese martial arts, and that led me to the school where I've been at for getting close towards 3 years, which is a Chinese martial arts kind of kung fu school. And so I practice Tai Chi and Swai Jiao are my main practices there. So Tai Chi, most people know, right? It's sort of this kind of more gentle meditative
Mhm.
movement. It is a martial art in terms of like the movement forms, the patterns, etc. Those are all martial arts movement forms. Obviously, the context is not mostly like a combat or competition, right? But it is a martial art. And then Swai Jiao is Chinese wrestling, and is really actually a sister style of Tai Chi. And so one of the things I really appreciate about being at this school is that I'm in my Tai Chi class, and our instructor can be like, "Oh, because I do both." He'll be say, "Oh, Yoshi, like see what we're doing here." He's like, you recognize that from our slideshow? And I was like, yes. So like just to see that crossover in terms of those movement patterns. Um, so I do Swai Zhao and San Shao, which is also called Sanda or Sanda, which is Chinese kickboxing. And so Swai Zhao is it's Chinese wrestling. It's a throwing style, most similar to judo in terms of what people know. And so we're trying to throw your opponent to the ground. There's no grappling. There's no ground game. It's like once you hit the ground, you stop, reset,
Okay.
and going. So yeah, it's been really fantastic to really kind of get back into that. Lotus does have a lot of judo incorporated into it. So there were, I was not kind of starting from zero. I had a lot of that, but I think being able to, get into that practice of like, oh, you know, how do you actually throw someone who is actively trying to both resist and throw you at the same time? It's very different than somebody who is like letting you throw them, which
Of
you need that
course.
for practice. So it's been really fun. And just through kind of circumstance, a little over a year ago, I competed for my first time in the Swaizhou Nationals, which is here in Cleveland. Actually, it turns out Cleveland is
Mm,
like a hot spot for Swaizhou, as
interesting. Okay.
for different reasons. And then was invited to join the Team USA and traveled to China in October
Wow.
to compete in the World Shuai Games,
How cool is
which
that?
it was, which yeah, was very very cool. It was really cool to go to China. I again, I'm like still quite new at it, so it's just like I'm just gonna go and enjoy the experience.
Mm.
And uh, and then since I was already in China, I added some time and I went down to the Wuding Mountain region, which is kind of the birthplace of Tai Chi and some of the other internal styles. For 10 days of immersive martial arts study at a school in Wuding Mountain and the Wuding Mountains. And I focus specifically on Baguazhang, which is a sort of circular fighting form that's an application of the I Ching, which is a Taoist book. It's the Book of Change or Book of Changes. And so it's all about sort of, the circular fighting forms and really sort of like how do you make rapid changes and sort of, a lot of I Ching is, there's a lot of, sorry, there's a lot of divination that comes out of the I Ching and sort of kind of tapping into that sort of deep kind of like intuition
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
whatnot. And so, yeah, I was like, I mean, Baguazhang is just a really cool style. And I was also like, oh, what does it look like to have this kind of ancient source text that
Yeah.
is then being applied into this movement or this embodiment style? And how can I sort of learn from that and sort of bring some inspiration and sort of have that dialogue, which we bring into our work at Mitsui Collective, an organization with Mitsui Method, in a parallel way to sort of tapping into Jewish texts, Jewish culture, etc. So it was yeah, just sort of, and just obviously a really rich opportunity to do that.
No, that's really amazing and really cool. I was just thinking that before I really started to get serious about Judaism, I explored a lot of Buddhism and I read a lot about the Taoists and all
Hmm.
that philosophy. And at first I thought they were so different from Judaism and like they couldn't mix or match or they didn't have anything in common. But later on, when I started to really study the Torah and everything, I found a lot of similarities
Yeah,
between these
yeah,
different Eastern philosophy and Judaism. And would you agree?
for sure. I think yes, there's a tremendous amount of sort of like overlap and
Right?
crossover. Um, yeah, I think kind of the digging into what is similar and what is shared and what is different. I think just like
Mhm.
that space is really interesting, and I
Right.
I certainly um sometimes we see this. I'm not you say this idea. I'm not saying you're saying this, but like you see this
Mhm.
idea that sort of like, oh, all religions or all philosophies are like 99.9% the same, and I'm like, well, that's not quite there,
Yeah.
and often, right, there are some like deeply shared, kind of truths or experiences or aspects of the human experience that are
Yeah.
shared,
Of course.
and so just kind of, yeah, I think yeah, I'm always fascinated where is that overlap? Where is the distinction, the difference? And
Mhm.
that space I think is really, really interesting. And so for sure, there's, yeah, so I've been doing a lot more of my own study, particularly in sort of in Taoism um, and and yeah, exactly, enjoying seeing like, oh, here's where there's some clear similarity, and then here's where there's some difference. Um, and I think one is it's so easy to just sort of like presume that all of these things are totally separate and have never talked to each other, so to
Mm.
speak. Right? And I make these assumptions, subconsciously, I made these assumptions myself, which is that, obviously we know that Judaism started in, land of, ancient Israel, or actually it started in Babylon and then travel over, but,
Mhm. Mhm.
in that part of the world. And then it's sort of like, okay, yeah, we know that there, I mean, Jews have been in diaspora. We know that there's, Mizrahi Jews who lived for centuries in, Iran and Iraq and for even further into Central Asia, etc. And then obviously Ashkenazi Jews. But it's sort of easy to subconsciously kind of only remember or think about that trajectory of like Israel up into Europe,
Right.
maybe back a little bit, and then like continuing west
Uh-huh.
to America, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, like that is one of the primary pathways I'm talking about over like many centuries.
Mhm.
But it's sort of like, oh yeah, but also Jews went the other way, right? And like
Yeah.
not they didn't just stop in Central Asia, right? Like they continued traveling. And yes, we know there are some like, like the Kaifeng Jews in China, like there are pockets. And I'm not talking about that, but I'm not only talking about that. It's just like there was this sort of cultural dialogue that has been
Mhm.
going on for the last 2000 or more years.
Right.
Um, and so it's sort of, and we know that Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism,
Hmm.
was deeply influenced by Sufism, which is, like Muslim mysticism, for example. Like those connections are really, really kind of clear and obvious if you study them. But it's sort of like, oh, there's also in actually in pre-Kabbalistic Jewish mysticism, we talk about the mother letters. This is from Sefer Yetzirah, which is the Book of Formation. So there are three mother letters, Aleph, Mem, and Shin. And so the mem, which makes the hum sound,
Hmm.
and that's
Hmm.
associated with Adamah, the earth, and sort of like it's the sort of like the diaphragms of the body. So like kind of like here we can feel that in the mouth of and like the hum in the like
Okay, yeah.
the pelvic floor, and then the hum of like resonating with the earth. And so you hear that and you're like, oh well, that sounds a heck of a lot like Om.
Oh, right.
And it's like, okay, like
Wow.
is were those completely divergent in terms of like, oh yeah, you just like people are just at some point we're playing with different sounds like
Hmm.
like kind of facilitates certain sort of expressions in the body that are sort of grounding and connective, and so here it turned into om and here it turned into the mem, maybe, but also we don't know that like those people, so to speak, that like didn't have any dialogue,
Yeah.
right? And so there, I think there's just that 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 is a story. In some cases, we just don't know where we've forgotten, but it's a story that we don't always tell. But it's really the story of like Judaism has always evolved in relationship to all of the cultures that we have been in
Yeah.
relationship with because we've been a diasporic people for the last 2000 plus years.
Yeah.
Um, and so sometimes we sort of only get very kind of narrow parts of that story, which
Hmm.
is actually a really expansive story, and it's still ongoing. And so for me, like that work of like, oh, where is there some interesting connection points between maybe it's like Taoism, right?
Hmm.
And, Jewish wisdom, or just like, Asian or Chinese like cultural practices that are part of my personal lineage that are also sort of, I mean, I live my life at the intersection of those things.
Of course.
And
Yeah.
like, I'm actually not doing anything different in terms of integrating that into my Jewish practice and expression than actually what we've been doing on this larger scale for 2000 years. It's just that this is a newer and less recognized form of that,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah,
Like,
because even so during the Havdalah ceremony, you had us do some breathing exercises, which reminded me a lot of what I do on my yoga mat when I
right,
practice yoga, right? And you
right.
had, was it you that brought the little salt lamp
Yes,
and
yeah, salt
everything?
crystal, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so I felt that little bit of Eastern influence there.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think, and it can get obviously it can get fuzzy, it can gray of when are you, and these are not always clear answers, but when are we um just the sort of like cultural appropriation versus dialogue is something that, and again, it's not always kind of clear. Sometimes it is clear, like when you cross that line, but it's often not so clear. And I think hopefully folks are bringing just that question and intention in. I think for me, how I look at it is saying, okay, what are the different sort of techniques and practices and forms that are part of different styles or systems, whether that be yoga or Tai Chi or, etc. Um, and I think it's sort of like it becomes very clear when we're sort of like appropriating or taking something when it's like we take like the very obvious form of something, like in yoga, like an asana, right? And then we try to just make that Jewish. I'm like, that I prefer not to do that, right? Same thing with Tai Chi. Like there are very specific forms that are part of Tai Chi, that I mean, this happens a lot. Like you sort of just like kind of slap a Jewish, like a Hebrew word or like a Jewish text, and we're like, oh, now we're doing this thing, but Jewish. And I'm just like, like I think one just that can really veer into the appropriation, and also I think there's not as much depth as there could be. And so in our work, we try to say like, okay, let's dig deeper and understand like why do some of these practices look how they look? Like how did they develop? What are they tapping into? What wisdom, what theological ideas, etc., is that tapping into? And the more we understand that, then we can kind of do this like deconstruction
Mhm.
to then say, so how might we take some inspiration, play with like breathing techniques, for example, where it's like, oh, we did some box breathing, right? Like it's a breathing technique, right? And then you can sort of like shape it in different ways where then it kind of brings some of that kind of cultural specificity, right? And sort of reconstruct in different ways that are sort of tapping into Jewish wisdom in some different ways. And again, it's not always clear, and sometimes we kind of like go a little bit towards one or whatever, but like I think that's what we kind of try to do. Or sometimes I'll take in, like Tai Chi, like the technique of push hands, which comes from Tai Chi, which is a way for us to really sort of like feel that sort of softness and the give and the take that is like a classic
Mm,
part of Tai Chi. And then sometimes I'm like, well, let's just name we're gonna do some push hands, and we're like borrowing this technique from Tai Chi to
mm.
explore some Jewish ideas.
Okay.
I don't know. I'm like exploring. I'm like, is that cool? I'm like, well, that's why I do try to name really clearly. Like, this is a Tai Chi technique, right? That's
Mhm.
where it comes from, and we're gonna play with it and adapt it and explore it. And I don't know. I think it's just like we're in the ongoing exploration of, all right, what's authentic, what's appreciation, what is what is the kind of convergence or fusing of culture in ways
Right.
that are respectful and productive, generative, you know. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's super interesting. See, I go to Chabad. My synagogue is Jewish Orthodox.
Yeah.
And so there's for the last, I don't know, like year or so, when I started to really get serious about it, part of me is saying if I don't go the Orthodox way, I'm half
Mm.
assing it, sort of, to say, pardon my French. Like, should I go all the way to really experience all the Jewishness,
Right.
or is it okay to still be me? Because I don't think in this lifetime I can put on a wig and, dress like the Orthodox and eat only kosher and all that. Like, I don't think I'm ready for that in this
Yeah.
lifetime. So maybe next life, but
Yeah.
so like I have this constantly these ideas in my mind. Like, am I doing enough? You know, what would
Yeah.
you say about that?
Yeah. A simple question.
Yeah. Mm.
Yeah. So in that question of like, am I doing enough? I'm thinking, we celebrated Passover, Pesach not so long ago, and we have this idea
Mhm.
of like Dayenu, right? Of like,
Mhm.
even if God had only done this thing, Dayenu would have been enough. And so
Right.
I think like there's always more that each of us in theory could do,
Hmm.
and yet we're also human and we're limited. So there's just like there's always more in theory, but just like to cultivate that feeling of our own internal Dayenu of like
Hmm.
enoughness and like we're created in the divine image, B'Tselem Elohim. So like that to me is sort of that is just a constant for all of
Right.
us. And it actually doesn't matter what we're doing or not doing, and the choices. It's not. There's no conditionality to that, right? The Torah doesn't say you're created in the divine image unless you do this thing or except when you don't do that thing. It just says
True.
period.
Yeah,
So
that's true.
that's like the foundation. Um, and I think the more we can just sort of stay connected to that internal sense of enoughness,
Hmm.
right? And I think part of that is like I'd say it's like almost, in my opinion, like a misinterpretation or where you could sort of use that to sort of you could use that to be really passive or sort of nihilistic of
Hmm.
like, oh, so I don't need to do anything then, right?
Right.
Uh,
How convenient. Yeah.
and like, oh, I don't need to keep learning and growing and whatever. And so it's like, what is that sort of balance where it's saying like, okay, my own enoughness is not conditional, it just is beautiful. And what is the expression of that? And how do I keep on exploring what that looks like for me? I mean, when you said just like, the like wearing a wig, for example, and different practices, I think that part of what that speaks to me is like, what are the ways in which we are like, how are we communicating these parts of our internal self in an external way, right? And so, there are, where it's wearing a wig or a head covering, or for like Orthodox men, like maybe wearing tzitzit, or like
Hmm.
there are actually like some of these ways that actually are these very external presentations of Jewishness.
Right.
Um, and it's not on me to say what's right, wrong, whatever. There's just obviously different ways. I think part of what I find really kind of compelling about embodiment is, I'm not saying the external doesn't matter, but I think so. We talk about embodiment as our way of being, right? So like, how do we move through the world, and what are we expressing through our actions and behaviors? And like, what does it look like to move through the world in a way that my embodiment expresses like what it means for me to be Jewish, as well as all the other parts of myself.
Hmm.
Um, and for that, like, and it's almost like you couldn't actually answer this, but it's a totally rhetorical question. But like,
Hmm.
what would it look like to be able to see just how somebody moves through the world, and be able to be like, oh, that person's clearly Jewish? And I don't mean the external, like, oh, they've, to like stereotype, like, oh, they've got a big nose, right? Like, obviously not that. I mean, like, because of like how they move, not what they look like, but
Yeah.
how they move, and there would be a million plus different answers to that, like, so that's why it's a rhetorical question. But is there a way where I'm tapping into my Jewish values, to how my Judaism informs just like who I want to be in the world, and how am I expressing that? And some of that is the external, like, oh yeah, I want to put these clothes on, or those clothes on, or wear this jewelry, or like,
Hmm.
I'm not saying we necessarily need to go to this like aesthetic, like we don't need to become monks, whatever, right? But like, how are we moving through the world? And I think that's where embodiment can really impact us in that way. And I think, one of the other things when you just say this sort of like the sort of going deep into Jewishness, I do think that one of the things that, Orthodox folks or folks on that kind of side, there is a deep sort of there's some deep immersiveness to that. Um, and obviously for some folks it works really well, right? And it's really, really beautiful. And for a lot of folks, it clearly is not like the right path for folks, or how they want to express their Judaism, or how they want to, or some cases maybe it's not values aligned in certain ways, like all sorts of different reasons why folks don't choose that path. um, but I think for me, in our work, what I want to really offer is like there are other ways to sort of have that level of sort of immersion and connection and authenticity, where my Jewishness is informing how I move through the world on a day-to-day basis. But I've got different options for that. Like, okay, like I don't need to like wear tzitzit necessarily, but like what else? Or maybe I'm not keeping a sort of traditional kashrut,
Hmm.
right? But like I'm not doing that if I'm not praying 3 times a day, if I'm not doing some of those sort of aspects of a more traditionally observant life. How do I take the Jewish ideas and values and still really incorporate them into my day-to-day practice? Because I think we run the risk, and I think we've seen this, where otherwise they just sort of sit up here and they're just really theoretical.
Exactly.
And so I do think that's where it's like, what are the ways that we can really bring that into our day-to-day life? And I think that's what sort of compels me about the idea of embodied practice, is it's a way to do that, where I can really be in practice.
Hmm.
I can have an embodied, my sort of like getting into the studio
Hmm.
several days a week, maybe, and that's part of my really like regular practice. And then it's also informing when I'm leaving the studio, right? Just like, still, how am I carrying myself? How am I interacting with people? All of those qualities that are just sort of like moving more and more towards, that person who I want to be in the
Yeah.
world. Um, Knowing I'll never completely get there, but also like Diana,
All right.
like enough, and I'm going to keep striving for,
Exactly.
yeah.
As long as, yeah, we keep growing. Okay, so then let's then finish with exactly what Mitsui Collective is.
Great.
Yeah.
Probably more helpful to say at some point. Yeah. Um, yeah. Great. So our work is to cultivate pathways to Jewish embodiment. Like as I said, we think about embodiment as our way of being. And I think embodiment really allows us to look at, okay, what are the formative elements that have really shaped who we are, both in how we see ourselves, how others see us. We do a lot of work sort of in racial identity as a big piece of sort of, that is really connected in to our physical bodies in terms of how we are racialized and how, we've sort of constructed different categories of race, et cetera. Um, Gender is also a really significant part of our identities that also has just a lot of like fuzzy gray, in terms of like what does that look like, especially in the modern world. Um, Thinking about what are the ways in which we have been formed and shaped by the different, from the people in our lives to the systems and the ideologies that also kind of surround and influence us, and particularly in the ways that have been constricting or oppressive and have um, limited us in really being able to become who we kind of fully or could be in our full selves. So there's a lot of our work that really ties into that sort of deeper understanding, and then really thinking about, okay, what are the dynamics that come into play when we're interacting with each other, right? Because of different racial identities, gender identities, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and then that's sort of like, okay, how have we come to be who we are, right? And our sort of shape in the world. And then that question of, okay, and who is it that we are striving to be both individually and collectively? And that's where the practice really comes into play. How do we practice more just like liberatory, deeply connected, rooted, healing patterns that allow us to interrupt those patterns of oppression, those patterns that have, that are harmful, and then create a space to then kind of um, recalibrate, right? And create new patterns, new neural pathways,
Mhm.
practice that in the body to, be working together towards, towards that sort of better world, deeper sense of understanding, connection to self. So that is kind of in the meta, our work and rooting in Jewish wisdom and identity expression. And then just like for another Jewish word, like the tachlis, the sort of like, um, the uh, technical or like whatever pieces, the sort of straightforward.
Okay.
We have both national work and local work. So, I live here in Cleveland, of course, and we have our local work. We have our national work, which is the Mitsui Institute of Jewish Embodiment. Um,
Awesome.
and as I said before, we started up just in time for the, global pandemic to start. So we actually kind of accidentally became a national organization when everything
I
moved online.
see.
And
Okay.
so that's where a lot of our institute work has emerged. And so we do a lot of travel for trainings and workshops, seminars. We do curriculum development, research, and that kind of thing through our
Mm.
institute, and really just sort of staying connected and helping to support this growing emerging field of Jewish embodiment. And then Studio Mitsui is our other branch, and that is, it's both the newest branch, but also is kind of like returning to the original seeds of our vision when we first started, which was to really be in practice with folks and to be really cultivating and strengthening and growing communities of practice
Mhm.
so we can support individual folks in having that ongoing practice of Jewish embodiment to just sort of help us to heal, to help us with our sort of holistic wellness in our bodies and our minds, emotionally, spiritually, all of that. And so we have an online studio that we started earlier this year, and then we are um, just getting started with our local studio here in Cleveland.
Mhm.
Uh, we've had a weekly Omer series that, as of the date of this taping, we're about to have our last one. But then we're, going to be, just kind of continuing to stay in practice with folks, and hopefully growing that community of folks that are getting together regularly to be in practice
Mhm.
together, to be in chavruta, right? To be in that embodied learning
That's
and
great.
partnership, relationship, and building community through that work. So yeah, Studio Mitsui is coming to Cleveland.
Awesome. That sounds really great. Wow. Yeah, no. Thank you for the work that you do in our community. And thank you, of course, for your time
Of
here
course.
today. So I will leave in the description of the episode all the links and information about Mitsui Collective. What does Mitsui, by the way, mean?
Yeah, Mitsui, it's a Hebrew Aramaic word. It means the activation of potential.
Cool.
Yeah.
Very, 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 very cool.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Real pleasure to be on, and looking forward to staying in community and staying in practice together.
Absolutely.